6. My Life in the Bluebear Mountains. Knowledge, Professor Nightingale bellowed in the classroom, opening his eyes until they were as big as saucers. Knowledge is night. This was a maxim derived from nocturnomathic philosophics, a subject taught exclusively at the Nocturnal Academy. In the Nocturnal Academy, Professor Nightingale often said such things, probably in order to disconcert us. There was a method in these seemingly nonsensical statements. By the time we grasped their total idiocy, our thoughts had strayed in every conceivable direction. This was precisely what the professor wanted, to steer our thoughts in as many different directions as possible. In this particular case, however, there was a grain of truth in what he'd said, for Professor Nightingale was a nocturnomath. Nocturnomaths are the most intelligent beings in Zamonia, and probably in the entire world, if not the universe. In normal lighting, they have an IQ of 4,000, but when darkness falls, it attains astronomical heights. That is why nocturnomaths favor the darkest conditions possible, and why Nightingale's Nocturnal Academy was housed in a dark complex of caves in the Bluebear Mountains. In his spare time, the professor was working on a system whereby darkness could be rendered darker still. To this end, he had installed a dark room where he alone was permitted to enter. We ourselves had no great desire to enter it in any case, for the noises we heard when we listened at the door were far from inviting. A run-of-the-mill nocturnomath has 3 brains, a gifted nocturnomath 4, a nocturnomath of genius 5. Professor Nightingale had 7. 1 was in his head, 4 grew out of his skull, and a 6th was located where the spleen normally resides. As for the 7th, that was an object of eternal speculation among his pupils. To the superficial eye, he looked rather small and frail. His spindly little arms dangled superfluously, it seemed, at the sides of his bent body, which was precariously supported by 2 wobbly legs resembling lengths of garden hose encased in trousers. He was slightly humpbacked, and his head, with its 4 external brains, was tremendously balanced on a long, scraggly neck. His big, bright eyes protruded so far from their sockets, we were always afraid they'd pop out of his head, especially when he became agitated. Yes, Nightingale made an extremely frail impression, but appearances were deceptive. He simply preferred to solve problems by dint of mental exertion. I was actually present one day when the professor opened a can of sardines merely by applying his mind to the task. After witnessing this feat, I never flicked another paper pellet at him behind his back. "You are very special," he would bellow at us, so loudly that we all gave a jump. He was forever reminding us that every graduate of his Nocturnal Academy was unique in his or her own way. He had a point, too. We were rather out of the ordinary. The Nocturnal Academy had precisely 3 pupils at this time: Freda the Alpine Imp, Cordy Uiap, the Gelatin Prince from the 2364th dimension, and yours truly, the Bluebear. Professor Nightingale made it a rule to only accept life forms on which it could be proved that only one example existed on Earth, so the Nocturnal Academy was very much an elite establishment. Perhaps I should give a slightly more detailed description of my classmates, and the teaching staff before proceeding with my story, because they will really merit some explanation. Freda, the Alpine Imp. Freda, the only female creature at the Nocturnal Academy, was madly in love with me. So much for the good news. The bad news, Freda was an Alpine Imp. And Alpine Imps may well be the ugliest creatures imaginable. No, let's not beat around the bush. Alpine Imps are far and away the ugliest creatures imaginable. From the Encyclopedia of Marvel's Life Forms and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and its Environs, by Professor Abdullah Nightingale. Alpine Imp, V. An inhabitant of the Impic Alps in southern Zamonia. The common Alpine Imp may generally be numbered, like the Guic troll and and the glacier gorgon, but unlike the Troglotroll or avalanche ogress, among the so-called guileless mountain demons, in other words, mountain-dwelling sprites devoid of evil intent. Although innocuous in manner, the alpine imp is condemned to relative solitude by its repulsive appearance. Yet the true extent of its ugliness cannot be detected. Providence has been kind enough to conceal alpine imps in a growth of matted hair so dense that their physical characteristics can only be guessed at. The sight of a clean-shaven specimen would be more than the eye could endure. Alpine imps usually vegetate among the highest peaks of the Impic Alps and can climb like chamois, equipped with the arms of a chimpanzee. There is a popular belief that they can even walk on clouds, but this unscientific conjecture may safely be consigned to the realm of legend. Alpine imps are trusting and affectionate by nature, but their feelings are seldom returned, a circumstance that has led to their gradual extinction. They can make a habit of landing on mountaineers' rucksacks from a great height. Having done so, they give vent to their affection by letting out a blood-curdling scream. This behavior accounts for the fact that any climber who has ever encountered an alpine imp never scales another mountain and becomes a deep-sea diver or a mine superintendent. Freda was startlingly immature and silly for her 400 years. She continually interrupted our lessons by making peculiar noises and bombarding me with paper pellets on which she'd scrawled hearts and arrows or declarations of love. She used to trip me up during break, sit on my back, and stick her pencil in my ear until I promised to marry her. I was powerless to resist these attentions, for Freda possessed the strength of 10 mountain gorillas. The reflexes of a puma and the stamina of a dolphin. No one in school was a match for her except Professor Nightingale himself. Freda couldn't speak, only scream, but Nightingale had begun by teaching her to write and presented her with a pen and thick memo pad. This she took everywhere with her. She communicated with us by means of these slips of paper, on which she wrote in copperplate. A conversation with her looked something like this. Hello, Freda. Freda. Good morning, Bluebear. Sleep well? Freda. So, I've got a nest full of Gloomberg bats in my hair. They squeaked all night long. Ugh. I couldn't return Freda's feelings, as I've already said, but I was very fond of her. If somebody loves you, you always love them a little in return, even when they're an alpine imp. Cordy. The Gelatin Prince. A gelatin prince from the 2364th dimension, QWERTY was as transparent as a jelly, and the best friend I made during my school days. We were all exceptional, but QWERTY was the most exceptional of us all. His place of origin was the 2364th dimension. There's a world that cannot be conceived of by anyone possessing fewer than 4 brains. QWERTY was not only a prince of the 2364th dimension, he was really its king, because he had been on the way to his coronation when he tripped over a fold in the red carpet and fell headfirst into a dimensional hiatus. The 2364th dimension is dotted with such holes. If you fall into one, you go tumbling through the entire universe into some other galaxy. Making your way back is extremely difficult. First, you have to locate a dimensional hiatus, which is hard enough in itself. It must also be the right one, of course, so that you find your way back into the right dimension, but more on that later. QWERTY was a prisoner in our world, therefore, but he bore his fate with remarkable composure. He liked to act tough and was always cracking jokes. He also devoted a great deal of thought to other people's cares and concerns, but being his best friend, I knew that when he was alone, he shed gelatinous tears and yearned for his home. Milk music. Everything there was quite different from our own world. For instance, QWERTY was accustomed to feeding on music, but even our most highbrow music struck him as crude and primitive. It should be explained that in the 2364th dimension, music is played on instruments made of milk. Professor Nightingale had devised a method of keeping QWERTY fed. Using sophisticated underwater microphones, he recorded the song of the seahorse, mixed it with the rhythm of the thunderclaps, the baying of the Baskerville hounds, the inaudible squeaks of bats, the groans of graveyard worms, and a few highly original noises of his own. He then played the whole thing backwards, at twice the original speed. Cordy confirmed that it bore a resemblance to the music of his homeland. The rest of us always left the room when he had his musical meals. Professor Abdullah Nightingale. Over and above his educational activities, the professor enjoyed an awesome reputation in contemporary Zamonia as a world-class scientist, explorer, and inventor. He had invented the ant motor, a form of propulsion based solely on the industriousness of Zamonian glow ants. These produced heat and thus sufficient energy when necessary to drive a steamroller at speed approaching that of sound. Fuel consumption was limited to a cup of honey poured into the machine from above. Professor Nightingale's inventions. The professor had also invented the volcanic suit, an all-enveloping garment of woven quicksilver galvanized with unmeltable ice, another of his inventions, in which you could not only immerse yourself in molten lava if you removed the hood, cut a dash at cocktail parties. During one of his dives in Krakatoa's still active crater, Nightingale discovered the lava-breathing firefish, a species he not only caught and tamed but contrived to use as the basis of a new invention, the firefish-powered cave heating system. If firefish were deprived of lava and placed in ordinary drinking water, they automatically changed their cellular structure and transformed themselves into a kind of living lava. These aquatic creatures breathed water like normal fish and thus made it boil. Firefish could also be used for brewing coffee, although they left a slightly fishy aftertaste. They were only really suitable in the gastronomic domain for making bouillabaisse. In the chlorophalaceous circulation of the Bloomberg, Alga Nightingale had localized the so-called supercalorie. A single one of these was sufficient to sustain an adult for a whole week. The professor endeavored to make giant's teeth algae the Nocturnal Academy's official school meal, but was thwarted by his pupils' aversion to them. His aqua shoes, which enable one to walk on water by solidifying it with the aid of H2O rays, remained in vogue only until it was found that the water which had congealed into a jelly could not be restored to its original consistency, because every body of water in and around Zamonia would eventually have been rendered unthinkable and unnavigable. Aqua shoes were banned throughout the continent. But Nightingale tried to make a profit even out of this setback. Having collected the solidified water, he diluted it with aromatic substances, cut it into slices, and sold it as edible water in an assortment of flavors. This product he named Professor Nightingale's Solid Soup. It didn't sell, however, because no one felt like eating soup on which people had tramped around in his peculiar shoes. Nightingale was also the inventor of the scintilla shower, a small plywood cubicle surmounted by a hopper in which he believed scintillas would accumulate if the occupant pondered on major problems. According to Nightingale's celebrated scintilla theory, scintillas were the basic material of the ideas, or invisible electro-paramagnetic aerial worms, which pullulated throughout the atmosphere. Because good ideas always crop up when least expected, Nightingale had advanced the theory that this phenomenon depended on the density of the scintillas in the surrounding air. He also believed that scintillas had a special predilection for dark, confined spaces smelling of pine wood. If a person sat in a dark, confined space smelling of pine wood and thought big thoughts, therefore, the scintillas would stream out of the copper into the scintilla shower and come rattling down on the seated thinker's head. Although the existence of scintillas and the effectiveness of the scintilla shower could never be scientifically proved, we pupils happily retired to the cubicle to smoke home-rolled cigarettes of Bloomberg algae. The Chamber of Unperfected Patents. Another of the professor's inventions was a gold extractor that filtered gold out of the most worthless pebbles, compressed it, and minted it into beautiful coins. He also devised a handy diamond press, with which a lump of anthracite could be compressed into a diamond in 1 second flat. The last two inventions had rendered Nightingale financially independent. He had taken out patents on self-cleansing toilet paper, magnetic paint, a flying carpet, chameleon wallpaper, the diabolic elf microscope with which Cordy and I examined species of our specimens in our spare time, cyclopean spectacles, and a chisel so tiny it would split an atom if your fingers were small enough to hold it. More romantic than useful was the furiometer, which could convert paroxysms of rage into harp sonatas. Nightingale was famous for the suicidal courage he displayed in the interest of scientific progress. One of his most daring experiments was a personal trial of the vibrogirdle. This belt was capable of causing the atoms in a body to vibrate so violently that the wearer could pulsate his way through any given object or someone else's body. Armed with a vibrogirdle, one could pass through a wall or a tree, the door of a safe or a pane of glass, without harming them or oneself. After several small-scale experiments with solid brick walls and sheets of metal, the professor decided to vibrate his way through the Gloombergs. The experiment was very successful at first. Nightingale swiftly penetrated the atomic structure of the ferruginous mountains and had reached their midpoint when the vibrogirdle simply cut out. He was imprisoned in the mountain's densest concentration of molecules and could neither advance nor retreat. Anyone else would have found this a nightmarish experience, but to Nightingale it was the best thing that had ever happened. Why? Because he had discovered that absolute darkness for the very first time. It is said that the basic ideas for all his subsequent scientific feats occurred to him in this state of utter darkness. After this incident, which transformed his life, he devoted himself almost exclusively to the study of lightlessness. This, of course, was possible only because his vibrogirdle was reactivated after a moment or two by a mild earthquake, registering 2 on the Richter scale. He kept the vibrogirdle and other unsuccessful inventions in a room at the Nocturnal Academy. This was secured with an airlock, a Nightingale device consisting of oxygen concentrate, and bore the following inscription: Unperfected Patent's Chamber. The contents of the room included a square-wheeled bicycle for climbing stairs, a type of vacuum cleaner for sucking up lightning, a pair of so-called quicksand trousers, and, of course, some aqua shoes. Nightingale had an interesting anecdote to tell about each of these objects. Deus ex machina featured in one of the ones about quicksand trousers. Years before, Mac had rescued the professor from a swamp into which he had waded to test the efficacy of the quicksand trousers. The latter were based on an inversion of the vibrogirdle principle and suffered from similar defects. Grains of sand got between the contacts of the sparking plugs of the crude motor that propelled the trousers, which cut out and left Professor Nightingale sinking in the quicksand. If Mac hadn't rescued him at the very last moment, needless to say, there would have been no Nocturnal Academy. Oops. I didn't mean to do that. In the classroom. Although I really can't pretend I went to school willingly, the professor's lessons did possess a unique quality. Once he started teaching, you forgot about everything else. When he finally tottered into the classroom, he was nearly always late, and removed his 4 motor boards, which he wore partly out of vanity and partly to keep his external brains warm. He got down to it right away. He also at the moment lost his tremulous movements and frail appearance. Prancing up and down in front of the class, light-footed as a ballerina, he presented his subject matter with a gift for mime and vocal acrobatics that would have enabled any actor, dancer, or singer to gain international stardom. Whatever the subject he was teaching, he had the knack for putting it over physically. With the aid of a few grimaces or contortions, nothing more, he turned before our marveling eyes into a zebra or a bluebell, a piece of rock crystal or a microbe, an atom or a Pythagorean theorem. Professor Nightingale had taken the teaching profession into the realm of art, and in art, as in all other disciplines he had mastered, he was a genius. We were taught no lessons, no single subject, in the traditional manner. Instead, every day was devoted to a long non-stop lecture by Nightingale in which he jumped from subject to subject, seemingly at random, holding forth sometimes on wind power, sometimes on poodle breeding or vegetable drugs, and pausing occasionally to scrawl a formula, foreign word, or diagram on the blackboard. Whenever he changed subjects, one could see him switch from one brain to the another. This he did by inserting his little finger into his left ear and turning it fractionally, screwdriver fashion. There was a faint click like a dislocated finger springing back into place. Sometimes, when he crashed his gears, it sounded as if a crowbar was being crushed between 2 cogs. It always set my teeth on edge, and Freda's bristly hair stood on end in any case, but QWERTY liked the sound because it reminded him of a pop song from the 2364th dimension. These abrupt changes of subject were far from arbitrary, however, that I didn't realize until much later. Listening to Nightingale was like reading a very long novel with a complicated plot whose threads didn't converge until the end, or like spending years watching a painter at work on an enormous mural. I did in fact spend years at the Nocturnal Academy, but they passed so quickly and eventually that I never got around to counting them. Simonian history. Having become acquainted with the world from above in Mac's company, I now explored it from within. I began to grasp how everything was connected, from the cellular structure of a dandelion seed to an exploding star in the Horsehead Nebula. I learned all there was to know about the origins and population of Simonia. I knew the names of all the kings, czars, princes, sheriffs, presidents, caliphs, popes, tyrants, sultans, and strongmen who has ever ruled the continent. I learned about their background, their boyhood, their eating habits, and the exalted or scatterbrained ideas that had prompted them to favor a particular form of government or driven them insane. I learned of the existence of such contrasting monarchs as the Pulpap Perth, the altruistic, who conducted affairs of state from a bed of nails, and Kidvul II, a megalomaniac who, purely for his personal delectation, erected a full-sized artificial volcano whose crater he used for staging operas based on the narrative poems of Wilfred the Wordsmith. We heard of Simonia's emergence from the sea billion years ago, of its original population of dinosaurs, megadragons, huge insects, bologs, and proto-demons, of their gradual extinction and the continent's colonization of other life forms from all over the world. Nightingale told us of the Cyclopses' 2,000 Years' War or the Great Waterkin Rebellion, of the building of Atlantis, and countless other events in Simonian history. Meeting the elements. From history, Nightingale made an instantaneous transition to physics. He mimed every element that goes to make up our planet, starting with the basic ones: fire, water, earth, and air. As fire, he writhed and undulated like the tongues of flame from a flambeau, producing such a genuine hiss and crackle that we began to feel quite warm, and thought we could smell smoke. As water, he began by rolling leisurely back and forth on the floor to illustrate the unhurried ebb and flow of the tides, then drew himself up into a tidal wave and rushed at us with such a convincing roar that we were all seized with a momentary fear of death by drowning. As earth, he first crumpled up like an ordinary clod, and then, delving ever further below the surface, mimed one rock formation after another until, having assumed the form of lava, he vented himself in an impressive volcanic eruption. I still recall how Freda shielded her face with her hands. As air, he began quite innocuously as a mere puff of wind. He frisked across the classroom, blew gently into Freda's unkempt hair, and fanned cool, agreeable breezes in our direction with his hands. By flapping them harder, he generated stronger winds that abruptly developed into squalls and then into tornado, which he mimed by rotating on his own axis like a demented Ventus sprite, spinning across the classroom, sending papers flying and sweeping the pencils off our desks. Meantime, he bellowed like a whole herd of panic-stricken buffalo. We gripped the desks and held on tight. After that came the subsidiary elements such as sulfur and iron, tin and iodine, cobalt and copper, zinc and arsenic, all of them perfectly illustrated in mime. Arsenic, for example, he portrayed by grabbing his throat and emitting a death rattle to show what happens if you swallow that element by mistake. Mercury by twisting his arms and legs into such contortions that they almost looked like butter melting on a hot plate. Sulfur by emitting loathsome farting sounds and disgusting smells that gave us a foretaste of hell. Lastly, he introduced us to elements that are now extinct but then possessed attributes that strike us today as magical, known as simolium, ronchium, and perpitium or unzium. They were the subject of the wildest myths, and there were adventurers throughout Simonia who still went prospecting for them. Zirmonium. But the rarest and most legendary element of all was zirmonium. I pricked up my ears as Nightingale began to speak of it, possibly alerted by the strange undertone his voice had suddenly acquired. The professor seemed ill at ease with this subject for the very first time. He disposed of it in conspicuous haste, merely informing us that zirmonium is the only element capable of thought, that only a small quantity of it existed, and that this had mysteriously vanished. Then he stuck his finger in his ear and quickly switched to another brain and a different subject. and class Retta kept passing me her little memo slips, most of them bearing poems that dealt with her two favorite subjects, her homesickness for the Impic Alps and her romantic obsession with me. They weren't great literature, but at least they rhymed. Oh, by the way, here's this. I don't think I showed this picture. And here's the two poems. I'll read them. For instance, Impic Alps so far away, listen to my sad refrain. Will there ever come a day when I see you all again? Or, blue must my beloved be, blue as billows in the sea, blue as bluebirds on the wing, blue as sapphires in a ring. Yellow, thank you very much, green I wouldn't even touch. As for red, it leaves me cold, but I'll love Bluebear till I'm old. XS. The dinosaurs. I preserve an especially vivid memory of the lesson in which Professor Nightingale portrayed the gradual emergence of our life on our planet, from the unicellular organism to the highest life forms in existence. He began by personifying a void, curling up into a ball and asserting in a faint, almost inaudible voice that he wasn't there. This one could well believe. He looked so small and inconspicuous at that moment. Indeed, had he told us he genuinely wasn't there, we would probably have gone looking for him in the passing outside. Then he started to develop, at first into a cell, a tiny sinuous creature that nervously wriggled through the warm primeval seas, shoulders twitching. Nightingale imitated a cell lurching through the prehistoric ocean until by degrees he calmed down and transformed himself into a jellyfish. He inflated his body, extended both arms, rotated very slowly on his own axis, and seemed to be sinking, elegant as an open sun umbrella, into the depths. Next he became transmuted into a primeval fish, a predator equipped with huge jaws protecting teeth. In search of prey, Nightingale dived under the desks and actually vanished for a while before suddenly rising to the surface with his eyes whirling wildly, a sight that frightened QWERTY almost to death. Thereafter he blew out his cheeks and turned into a plump toad. This waddled along on dry land, croaking loudly until it abruptly transformed itself into a huge, vicious, hissing alligator. Nightingale himself was so pleased with this performance that he slithered across the classroom on his belly a couple of times, teeth bared, snapped at our ankles until we all climbed on our desks, squealing in terror. Highly delighted by this little joke, he proceeded to turn into a dinosaur. To begin with, he portrayed a leisurely herbivore, the huge but harmless brontosaurus. He lumbered ponderously to and fro, extended his long neck, and browsed on the pot of geraniums on his desk. To our amusement, he plucked a few of the flowers with his lips and munched on them with relish. Eventually, and this sight etched itself into my memory forever, he presented an impressively authentic personification of the Tyrannosaurus rex, the most dangerous carnivorous predator of its day. Getting up off all fours and standing erect, he peered around the classroom, ran his tongue over his teeth in a slow, sinister fashion, and scratched himself behind the ear with one little claw-tipped foreleg. Then he raised his head, screwed up his big round scientist's eyes into narrow, menacing slits, and sniffed the air in all directions. We all suddenly felt like dinosaur food. Nightingale, or rather Tyrannosaurus nightingaleus, threw his head back and let out an ear-splitting roar. It was the most frightening sound I'd ever heard, and bellow of Chromatica insularis included. Freda leapt from her chair, jumped on my back, and clung there, trembling. QWERTY adopted a defensive stance to the extent that a gelatinous creature from the 2364th dimension can stand up at all. I prepared to bid the world farewell. The dinosaur turned its head back and forth as if unable to decide which of us to devour first. Then, with lizard-like gait, it slowly waddled toward us. I could have sworn the ground shook with every step it took. Saliva dripped from its jaws, and I felt quite sure that this time Professor Nightingale had lost his reason, that each of his 7 brains had malfunctioned simultaneously, and that he would act out his Tyrannosaurus rex role to the bitter bloody end. We had all crawled under the desk and were clinging to each other in terror. Saliva dripped onto the classroom floor as the Tyrannosaurus bent over us with parted lips and treated us to its craftiest grin. Then suddenly stopped short and looked up as if it could hear an alarming sound in the distance. With a grunt of surprise, it took a crumpled piece of paper from the desk and tossed it into the air. The ball of paper landed on its head. As if fatally injured, it staggered dramatically toward us, let out another spine-chilling roar. and finally collapsed only inches away. The professor had just demonstrated what caused the dinosaurs to become extinct, a shower of enormous meteorites. Only the dinosaurs had disappeared, Professor Nightingale's lecture concluded. There was really only one more interesting stage in the development of life. He spread his arms wide and grinned. It's right here in front of you, a nocturnomath, the zenith of creation. We were given no homework, no classroom projects, no marks, no oral tests. Nightingale asked no questions, never checked our state of knowledge, and never urged us to pay attention. He simply spoke when we listened. Asking questions was completely taboo. Nightingale alone decided what subjects to tackle and when, what syllabus to study, and it was time to move on to something else. He was like a radio whose knobs were being twiddled by a madman. He jumped from molecular biology to petrology, from petrology to ancient Egyptian architecture, from that to the study of putrescent gases on other planets, and from that to entomology, with a detour that embraced the portrayal of three-winged Simonian bee in Atlantic encaustic paintings of the 14th century. We were taught what mattered most about Florentine cheese sculptures. The caryatid culture of the sacred buildings of Grelsund, the therapeutic properties of the Peruvian ratania root, the mating dance of the Midgard serpent, the properties of the Peruvian ratania the leading lights of Simonian speleology, of whom Nightingale was one, and the 250 principles governing the Alphavillian Declaration of Independence, all in a single afternoon. Our spare time. Between classes we loitered in the gloomy tunnels or killed time in our bleak windowless rooms. Occasionally we ventured out into the ledge in front of the entrance to the Nocturnal Academy, where Mac had dropped me. We never lingered, however, because conditions at that altitude were extremely cold and windy even in summer. We simply stood there, drawing in deep draughts of air until we developed hallucinations. Once we had satisfied our need for oxygen, we retired to the gloomy maze of tunnels. We took no physical exercise, which Professor Nightingale thought absolutely pointless. He held all that forms of sport killed off essential brain cells. Every overdeveloped muscle has a major intellectual achievement on its conscience, was his considered opinion. There were no forms of entertainment, no games or books or anything else that might have distracted our attention for the professor's lessons. When one lesson ended, he would promptly retire to the darkroom to pursue his darkness experiments while we hung around, ate canned sardines, or dozed until he emerged and embarked on the next. Lessons were our only source of interest in the Gloombergs. That, no doubt, was another reason why Professor Nightingale had chosen to establish his Nocturnal Academy there. The 2364th dimension. I whiled away many an afternoon by persuading Qwerty to tell me about the 2364th dimension. He didn't like to do so because it aggravated his homesickness, but once he started there was no stopping him. For some reason, there were a lot of carpets in his native dimension. One might even say that it consisted almost entirely of carpets, any gaps between them being occupied as a rule by dimensional hiatuses. In the 2364th dimension, a carpet denoted safety and stability. Miss one, and you went hurtling into space. This was why carpet weaving was the art that enjoyed the highest local esteem. Great efforts were made to turn every inhabitant of 2364, as I must call Qwerty's homeland for want of a proper name, into an efficient carpet weaver. All other activities were held to be forms of idleness. Try as he genuinely did to convey some idea of 2364's carpets, and Qwerty found it impossible to describe their manifold patterns and weaves, shapes and colors, sizes and materials. Wall-to-wall carpeting was frowned on, of course. Although there were broadloom carpets of vast dimensions, they never ran right up to the walls because there weren't any walls in 2364. Qwerty told me of lovingly hand-woven runners made of pure gold thread, and of others consisting of several layers of cobwebs for durability's sake. The inhabitants of 2364 had raised the art of weaving and knotting to a level that defies our comprehension. They could produce a carpet out of any conceivable material. According to Cordy, 2364 boasted carpets made of glass, wood, sheet metal, and marble, even tea. Everything was expressed in carpet form. Cordy reported enthusiastically that poems and whole novels and epics were woven into looms, as were newspapers for adults and long-colored runners, with plenty of pictures and not much text for children. Very small, wafer-thin rugs served as banknotes, and for transportation the inhabitants used flying carpets of medium size for the larger carpet buses, for which bus stops were installed throughout the 2364th dimension. For entertainment purposes, one visited the Carpet Museum. Displayed there were carpets from bygone eras made of obsolete materials and bearing mysterious inscriptions in the runes of long-extinct languages, ancient specimens rendered to so threadbare by years of constant use that one could look through them into space. Contemporary artists vied with one another in devising new shapes and colors. There were circular and triangular carpets, star-shaped and corrugated ones, incredibly wide ones, and some whose pile was so deep you had to fight your way through it like someone waddling through a field of wheat. In addition, every inhabitant of 2364 wove an autobiographical carpet, a sort of diary, retirement home, and shroud all in one. All the memories, information, scenes, and events people deemed important were woven into the carpet as time went by. Their latter years, during which it became steadily more dangerous to walk on other people's carpets, they spent largely on their own, passing by time by looking at the scenes and memories they had recorded. When they died, they were rolled up in the carpet and thrown down a dimensional hiatus. Personally, in view of all their efforts to avoid these pitfalls during their lifetime, I found this a rather barbaric practice. As for Cordy, it greatly saddened him that he no longer possessed an autobiographical carpet of his own. Canned sardines. Meals at the Nocturnal Academy were as follows. Professor Nightingale never ate at all, or so it was said. He was rumored to live on darkness. For everyone else, discounting Cordy, there were canned sardines. Since Professor Nightingale attached no importance to food, he wasn't too concerned about his pupils' diet. I don't care what they eat as long as it's always the same thing, was his motto. Foodstuffs appealed to him only if they were very long-lasting, easy to prepare, extremely filling, and sold in stackable containers. Canned sardines perfectly fulfilled those requirements. The Nocturnal Academy's pupils made a virtue of necessity and devised the most ingenious ways of preparing them. There was nothing to wash them down with except pure spring water, which came straight from the rock. We were set no homework or exams, as I have already said, and there was nothing but we might have assured Professor Nightingale that we were listening to him at all, let alone retaining what we heard. Even so, I had the feeling that I was becoming steadily brainier, and I could tell that the others were too. The thing was, we had taken to discussing and, if possible, cracking problems after school, which the professor had only broached in class and left unresolved. Our standard of conversation rose day by day. Having begun by working our simple sums or correcting our spelling mistakes, we compiled our own logarithmic tables and deciphered some early Simonian hieroglyphs unaided. After a few months, we tackled the doctrines of Manu Cantemel, the founder of Gralsundian demonism, and not only disproved them all, but demonstrated that he had based them on an 11th century message in a bottle from Yule. Whenever Freda wasn't actually clinging to my back and inserting writing implements in my facial orifices she had recently started on my nostrils, we sat in the dining room and wrangled over Haconian xenoplexy, or the fluctuations of elf-wing atoms when exposed to magnetism. A philosophical debate. One discussion between Freda, Cordy, and myself ran more or less as follows. I'm just working on the foundations of South Simonian Yabism. Cordy. Oh, you mean the philosophical school of thought which assumes that no one object implies the existence of any other provided they're viewed with the requisite insensitivity? Precisely. Cordy. A most interesting intellectual approach. I infer from it that experience is the sum of ignorance plus militant stupidity. Freda. I entirely disagree. That's far too crude a theory for my taste. It's what happens when barbarians devote themselves to philosophy. The founder of Yabism grew up in a swamp and hits his critics on the head with a club. Everyone knows that. Let's talk about astronomy instead. I've lately come to the conclusion that the universe isn't expanding at all, but it isn't contracting either, it's simply vacillating. Cordy, are you talking about a self-contained model of the world with the curvature symbol K equals +1, in which phases of expansion and contraction periodically alternate? Aye, now that's too crude for my taste. And so it went on. A sound education. I became incredibly well read, although there wasn't a single book in the whole academy. In one of his lectures, Professor Nightingale made a passing reference to the Cyclopean Crown, the epic poem by Wilfred the Wordsmith. Within a few hours I could recite it, from start to finish, word for word, knew the forename of every Zamodian deity, and could have turned out some flawless hexameters of my own. Nightingale also said something about Johann Zafritter's The Black Whale, a 4,000-page novel describing the hunt for a Tyrannomobius rex, and before long I had not only memorized the entire text, but knew how to attach a line to a harpoon and coil it around a bollard in the stem. I also knew what whale was in Latin, Greek, Icelandic, Polynesian, and Yoholian, to wit, cetus, valor, piki, nui nui, and trum. At the risk of being suspected of bragging, I was a walking encyclopedia of general knowledge. I had mastered all the languages in the known world, both dead and in current use, including all the Zamodian dialects, and they alone numbered over 20,000. I knew whole sonnets of Zamodian Baroque poetry by heart, was an expert on Atlantean air painting, those guardian mind singing, and the analysis of the comet's tails. I could calculate the hourly expansion of the universe by observing the oscillations of the Bloomberg algal cell, replace a dislodged auditory oscil with pincers, determine the blood group of a fossil insect by means of ommatial diagnosis, and gauge the number of animalcules in a glass of water from their weight with my eyes shut. Grailsun Library, Zamodia's largest collection of specialized works on demonology, did not list as many titles in the inventory as I myself carried in my head, although I detested mathematics. The squaring of circles, the cubing of ellipses, and the solving of problems in all kinds were child's play to me. My knowledge was far from confined to literature, the sciences, philosophy, and art. I was also versed in every conceivable sphere of daily life. I knew how to repair a church clock and cut a camshaft, how to calculate the statics of a dam, trepan a skull, and construct a time bomb, how to put up a solid bell frame and clear a blocked toilet, how to tune a cello and palpate a liver. I could draw the ground plan of a cathedral, conduct a symphony orchestra, and calculate the trajectory of a cannonball in a crosswind. I could, in no time at all, have fashioned an elegant lady's shoe out of a piece of untanned leather, and a stout thatched roof out of reeds. I knew how to grind a lens and brew a tasty wheat beer. I knew the names of every star in the sky and every microorganism in the ocean. Freda's farewell. The one thing I didn't know was the source of all this knowledge. Then came the day when Freda left us and was sent out into the world, her school days having ended. I should really have been relieved to be rid of such a pest, but I wasn't. Freda was my first love, after all, even if she was only an ugly alpine imp, and our relationship was pretty one-sided. I'd grown accustomed to her, that's all, and she was simply irreplaceable when it came to bringing our intellectual flights of fancy down to earth. I failed to understand how Nightingale could be heartless enough to kick her out, for that was just what he did. Alpine imps have a congenital inability to cry, unfortunately, or she would have doubtless kicked up a terrible fuss. Her leave-taking was an extremely subdued occasion. Freda was given no party, no diploma, or school leaver's certificate. She simply said goodbye to us all, to me with a hoarse croak and an overly wet kiss, and then was conducted by Professor Nightingale to a fork in the tunnel. With a last sad wave in my direction, she hesitantly disappeared through the Nocturnal Academy's official exit, which was rumored by its pupils to lead into the labyrinth of passages that threaded the interior of the Bloomberg Mountains. On returning to the classroom, we found Freda's desk occupied by a newcomer, a timid unicorn named Flower Grazer. Flower Grazer was as unlike Freda as anyone could possibly imagine. A quiet, attentive pupil, he spoke in a low, inaudible voice and was boring in the extreme. He devoted his spare time to writing poems, all of which dealt with unicorns who were lonely, deeply distressed by their solitude, and called Flower Grazer. A change sets in. Professor Nightingale's lessons had undergone a change of some kind, and I'd recently found it difficult to follow him. Although the subjects were no harder and his lectures as fascinating as ever, I simply couldn't take them in anymore. No sooner was school over for the day than I lost all recollection of what I'd been taught. I sometimes caught myself not listening at all and allowing my thoughts to stray. On such occasions, when subjected to keen glance from Professor Nightingale, I would feel guilty. Although I still solved differential equations in my head after school, it seemed to me that I was growing steadily more dim-witted. Neo and Weenie. After a short time, the Nocturnal Academy acquired some more new pupils, two rather uncongenial individuals named Neo and Weenie. Neo was the last surviving representative of a species known as the barbaric hog, which really says it all. He had more muscles than a plow horse and incredibly bad manners. When you were talking to him, he either kept punching you or slapped you on the back with one of his fat trotters. He had short, greasy hair, foul breath, and although he was only 8 years old, a bad case of 5 o'clock shadow, he was continually uttering oaths in which prominent roles were played by all manner of gods, giants, and other legendary creatures. By the Midgard serpent, he would cry, or may the mega dragon devour me if it isn't true. When we were in bed at night, he used to torment us with his prodigious flatulence, in which, to crown everything, he appeared to be proud. Watch out was the customary prelude to one of his phenomenal farts. Here comes Wotan's revenge. The rest of us would pull the covers over our heads and hold our breath until the worst was over. It would have been pointless to remonstrate with Neo because he was stronger than any of us, now that Freda had gone. Weenie was a gnomelet, the last of that family of miniature cyclopses. Gnomelets were a rather degenerate form of cyclops, neither strong nor awe-inspiring, nor possessed of any other notable cyclopean attributes, but disagreeably pushy, sneaking, cowardly, lazy, arrogant, covetous, and greedy. Weenie was also short-sighted, not that he could help that. He kept fixing people with his single piercing eye, which didn't exactly add to his charms. It was amazing how many obnoxious qualities could be accommodated in such a small body. Weenie always insisted on talking big, although he had little to say, for his intellect was barely more developed than Neo's. He was the kind of miniature cyclops that picks a quarrel, then hides behind someone bigger and stronger and incites him to violence. Looked at from that angle, Neo and Weenie were the worst possible combination. I think that's supposed to be Neo. Yeah. And that's supposed to be Weenie. I lose my one remaining friend. When QWERTY finally had to quit the Nocturnal Academy, my world almost collapsed. From then on, I became stranger among strangers. It's an absolute certainty that we'll never see each other again, said QWERTY, when bidding me farewell. I intend to throw myself into the first dimensional hiatus I can find, and the odds against our meeting again will be 460 billion to 1. No, I replied, having swiftly worked out the statistical problem in my head. 463 billion to 1. It really was extremely unlikely. The chances of winning the lottery 15,000 times in succession with tickets brought the same counter were in fact greater. I silently shook QWERTY's gelatinous hand, then Professor Nightingale conducted him to the exit tunnel. After that, my sojourn at the Nocturnal Academy became steadily more unendurable. Even the lessons had become a torment. It no longer interested me to hear what Professor Nightingale had to say about the crystalline structure of snowflakes, the habits of the Andean llama, or the brushwork of the calligraphers of the Eastern incisors. His pearls of wisdom ran off me like water off a duck's back. I had reached the stage where I no longer understood what he was talking about. In fact, I sometimes felt he was speaking an entirely unknown language. Another philosophical debate. Still more of a trial, however, were the evenings I spent with my new classmates. Their standard of education was shockingly low. They were just getting to grips with multiplication and capitals or lowercase letters, whereas I was debating major problems of astrophysics in my head. One night, Neo and I had an argument about the nature of the universe. He had an appallingly crude conception of the physical world. The earth is a bun floating in a bucket of water, he asserted defiantly. And what is the bucket standing on? I demanded, trying to floor him. The bucket stands on the back of the great cleaner, who polishes the universe to all eternity, Neo replied self-confidently. This universe she polishes so assiduously, I said. What in the world does that stand on? The universe doesn't stand on anything, it lies, Wheatley put in. The universe is as flat as a slice of sausage, you see. And what, pray, does a slice of sausage lie on? I had him now. On the bun, of course, replied Neo. You simply don't have a rational argument with such barbarians. To take my mind off Neo's farts, Flower Grazer's lamentations, and Weenie's bragging, I had developed the habit of solving philosophical riddles that had ever been solved before. One night, when sleep had eluded me yet again, because a philosophical problem was preying on my mind, I was reflecting that I was bigger than Weenie, so I was big. At the same time, however, I was smaller than Neo, so I was small. But how could I be big and small at the same time? I passed Professor Nightingale's darkroom on my way to the canned sardine store. The professor's darkroom. A terrible splintering sound penetrated the heavy door and went echoing along the passage. Whenever the professor was pondering an especially ticklish problem, he made a noise like a nutcracker demolishing a large walnut. The noise issued straight from his brains, a fact that impressed me on the one hand and gave me the shivers on the other. I was about to tiptoe on when a loud "Come in" made me freeze in mid-movement. No pupil had ever been privileged to set foot in the professor's mysterious domain. I was beginning to think I'd made a mistake when I heard Nightingale's voice a second time. "Come in, but don't let any light in." On opening the door, I felt as if the darkness were flowering over me like molasses. "Come in and shut the door," Nightingale commanded, so I obediently tiptoed inside. The gloom that enveloped me when I shut the door behind me was so absolute that I got the wind up. It was a darkness that I could feel on my skin, the way I felt it on Hobgoblin Island, when for the very first time I spent a night without the lady lights on. But this darkness was audible as well. It gripped me like an icy fist making a humming sound so faint and despairing that my fur stood momentarily on end. I hadn't been in the chamber for more than a few seconds when I got the feeling I'd been blind since birth and had no idea what light was. I groped for the doorknob, but I didn't even know where ahead or behind were, still less up or down. I felt I was floating in starless space, weightless and utterly alone. "Don't go," Professor Nightingale said sharply. "One gets used to it." I hadn't the slightest notion where he was. My dearest wish was to run for it, screaming in terror, but I strove to remain polite. "It's very dark in here, I understand." "Poppycock," barked the professor. "The ambient lighting registers 400 nightingales. The nightingale, I knew from my lessons, was a unit of luminosity invented by the professor himself. Modesty wasn't his long suit. A nightingale corresponds roughly to the light prevailing on a starless night during a lunar eclipse. To take a more down-to-earth example, the interior of an airtight refrigerator registers when the door is shut and light has gone out, precisely one nightingale. Thus, a luminosity of 400 nightingales was equivalent to the darkness prevailing in 400 closed refrigerators. It was correspondingly cold as well. The nightingaleator is running at only half speed. I have even blindfolded myself because I find the light too bright. Nightingale removed the blindfold. I could tell this because his eyes glowed in the dark like a pair of searchlights. A Nocturnomath's eyes always glow even in the daylight, but the effect was far more impressive in absolute darkness, perhaps because the brains revving away behind them. Caught in their beams, I somehow felt guilty. "Why creep around in the middle of the night, eh?" the professor demanded, playing the twin beams over my face. "I couldn't get to sleep because I couldn't get a philosophical problem out of my head." I was turning it over in my "Nonsense," Nightingale brusquely cut me short. "You couldn't get to sleep because Neo, that antediluvian idiot, pollutes the air with his barbarous expulsions of wind. You couldn't get to sleep because you can't take any more of your classmates' childish chatter. You couldn't get to sleep because you miss your conversations with Qwerty and Freda." The old man simply knew everything. He shook his head, then the beams from his eyes roamed the room like those of a lighthouse. "You've been here too long. Now your time is up. One moment I'll switch off the nightingaleator." The nightingaleator. I heard a series of faint, mysterious clicks, and it slowly grew lighter. Although the lighting that now prevailed would undoubtedly have been described as dim under normal circumstances, I found it quite bright after the darkness that had preceded it. I could at least distinguish the outlines of the curious apparatus Nightingale was tinkering with. It looked like a factory in miniature, or rather like several interconnected factories with countless smokestacks, boilers, cables and cogwheels, pumps and engines, occasional jets of flame. There were bellows rising and falling, pistons sliding in and out, little chimneys that emitted occasional jets of flame, and air shafts with black steam issuing from them. The reader may perhaps object that black steam doesn't exist, and that I'm confusing it with black smoke. I must nonetheless insist that the odorless water vapor issuing from the nightingaleator was black as night itself, not white. I even thought I discerned some shadowy little figures flitting around on the iron stairways and catwalks, miniature factory workers carrying tiny spanners, but that, I'm sure, was just my imagination. The mechanical pounding gradually slowed, but never ceased entirely. What exactly is a nightingale-lator? I ventured to ask. A nightingale-lator, the professor proudly and promptly declared, as if I'd pressed a button on his chest, is a darkness manufacturing machine invented by myself, with the aid of the so-called nightingale lasers, generated by this wonderful contraption exceptionally dark. Starless patches of night can be cut out and transported straight to this chamber, where the nightingale-lator stores and refines them. This enables me to bottle the darkness like wine from a cask. I can also condense or dilute it as required. A triumph of darkness research, or nightingaleology, as is termed by experts in the scientific field. The sole expert in this field, of course, was Nightingale himself. It was only then that I spotted the big telescopic tube projecting for the nightingale-lator to the ceiling. Unlike a normal telescope, this one had a kind of knot in the middle. With the ceiling I made out an aperture that could be closed like the camera's diaphragm. It must have led to a shaft through which the night was visible. The night sky was visible. The darkness in here, I said for something to say. Does it come from outer space? It does indeed, my boy. You won't find denser darkness anywhere. It's the eternal blackness of the universe. Did you know that 90% of the universe consists of dark matter? No one has ever been able to observe it until now. Its existence could only be inferred from its gravitational effects, but I, with my nightingalescope, have discovered and isolated it. The nightingalescope. He gestured grandly at the telescope. Whenever you look up at the stars, you're seeing the past. The lights of the stars you see in the firmament is millions or even billions of years old. People are always talking about the light of the stars, but the darkness between them is just as old, indeed much older as a rule, and there's far more to it. Darkness ages like wine. The older it is, the better. The darkness in this room is nearly 5 billion years old, an exceptionally fine vintage. He sniffed and smacked his lips like a connoisseur sampling an expensive bottle of claret. I won't overtax your brain with details, besides it's a top-secret matter. All I can tell you is that I've invented a sophisticated system of prisms, lenses, and mirrors that enables me to bend my nightingale lasers in space and send them through a wormhole. He sat back complacently, fitting his fingertips together, and twiddled his thumbs like a barrister who has just presented the judge with a cast-iron alibi. A wormhole, to quote a standard item of knowledge in the Nocturnal Academy syllabus, was a kind of shortcut through space, a secret tunnel in the space-time continuum through which very distant points in the cosmos could be reached more quickly than usual. If I had understood him correctly, Nightingale was saying that he'd sent his lasers on a sort of time-warp journey through space. And that's not all. He indicated another part of the nightingale-lator, one that resembled a mechanical hedgehog. My rays are capable of cutting out sizable chunks of cosmic darkness. Then, with the aid of this retromagnetic particle vacuum cleaner, the Nightingale 3000 patent pending, I can suck the said material straight out of the universe. Imagine darkness direct from the furthest corner of the cosmos, vacuum packed for millions of years, here on this very table. Darkness can get no darker. The professor emitted a grunt of triumph. Black holes. All the cutting process leaves behind in the sky are holes so abysmally dark that they annihilate light itself. Future generations of scientists will rack their brains over the source of those black holes. Tee-hee. He said no more for a while, just grunted to himself in an absent-minded way. But I still haven't found a way of putting this dark material to good use, he growled. It's here, but it has no practical applications. It's so darned negative. He lapsed into a brooding silence. I felt I ought to say something encouraging. Perhaps the material must first get used to its new environment. I will remember my first week in the Gloombergs. I myself felt... Pooh, the professor cut in brusquely. What do you know about the mysteries of the universe? He was right. What did I know about them? My brain was really feeling rather overburdened with details. Having made enough of a fool of myself already, I already thought I'd better bow out as gracefully as possible. Well, I said as I edged toward the exit, or what looked like to be the exit, it's getting late. I won't intrude you any longer. The door's on the opposite direction, Nightingale murmured vaguely. Then a sudden thought seemed to strike him. No, don't go. Stay here, please, he said in an uncharacteristically polite and gentle tone. We could have a bit of a chat. This was a novelty. Nightingale had never conversed with me before. He never conversed with anyone on principle. To him, a conversation meant that he held forth while others greedily absorbed his pearls of wisdom. He welcomed the occasional timid question because it gave him a chance to deliver another lengthy monologue, but he disliked empty chatter. Nocturnamats hate conversations. You've probably been wondering how you managed to learn so much in so short a time, Nightingale began. Perhaps I'm exceptionally gifted, I hazarded rather incautiously. Gifted? Pooh, nonsense, he barked so loudly that I retreated a step. Intelligence bacteria. Forgive me, he lowered his voice again. He was simply unused to holding a normal conversation, but he was doing his best. Does Neo strike you as gifted? That porcine blockhead with a brain the size of an atomic nucleus. When the lights go out, he thinks the world around him ceases to exist, but by the time I'm through with him, he'll be knowledgeable enough to construct a submarine blindfolded, or discover a cure for the common cold. It's nothing to do with brains. It's bacteria. Bacteria? I know, of course, that bacteria were minute organisms capable of transmitting diseases. Precisely. You must simply conceive of knowledge as a disease. A disease we nocturnamaths transmit. The closer a person comes to a nocturnamath, the more knowledge he becomes infected with. Take a step towards me. I did so, although I was far from reassured by the thought that he was a source of infection. I had never been as near him before, not even in class. Closer, Nightingale commanded. I took another step, and suddenly a tide of information surged through my brain. It was all to do with the darkness research, a subject I had never studied in any detail. All at once I felt I was an expert in that field. So tell me, the professor demanded, what do you now know about darkness? Oh, it's all quite simple once you rid yourself of the preconceived idea that darkness is merely the absence of light. I was astonished to hear myself say, you have to learn to treat light and darkness as energy sources of equal status. That's just the trouble, Nightingale put in. The thing is, darkness has such a bad reputation. People always associate it with unpleasant things, but it's simply another, albeit darker, form of luminosity. We need it quite as much as we need light. Without darkness, everything would wither and die. There would be no sleep, no relaxation, no energy, no growth. Night gives us the strength to withstand the rigors of the day. Haven't you ever wondered why we feel so refreshed and full of energy after a good night's sleep? To be honest, no, I felt ashamed. I was so concerned with the ultimate problems of philosophy that I had never asked myself that simple question. It's because the darkness we've taken on board. A nap during the day is no good at all. You tend to feel more lethargic than ever, am I right? Darkness is pure energy. Your reserves became depleted during the day. You burn them up, grow weary, and have to sleep some more. In the dark you accumulate fresh strength and so on. I'm convinced that a person who only lives at night need never die. I was tempted to conclude that Professor Nightingale was speaking of himself. He was immensely agitated. His glowing eyes protruded from their sockets like red-hot cannonballs. His voice rose still higher. On the contrary, he declared, that person would accumulate more and more strength until he developed into something surpassing our present powers of comprehension. Highly distilled intelligence coupled with immortality, eternal life, eternal night, eternal intelligence. All at once it sounded as if a spanner had fallen into the works. The professor had changed gear again. He thumped one of his external brains with the heel of his hand. But I digress. What had I got to? The bacteriological transmission of knowledge. Right, the nearer you are to me, the smarter you will become. It's as simple as that. But the problem is, your gray cells can only absorb so much. Not everyone can have 7 brains, can they? Your capacity for absorption is now exhausted. That's why you can't concentrate on your lessons anymore. I blushed. So he noticed. That's right. It simply means your time is up. I was already familiar with that sudden husky tone of voice and knew that it heralded a change. I'd heard it from the babbling billows and from Mac, from Feta and QWERTY. It signified that a departure was imminent. There is nothing more that I can teach you, the professor went on. You know now as much as 100 universal scientists, world chess champions, and brain surgeons rolled into one. That ought to be enough to launch you on a suitable career. I'm short of space here, so a new pupil will be taking your place. Your school days are over, my lad. Tomorrow I shall conduct you to the exit tunnel. It's a long track through the mountains, but a Bluebear with your brains will find the way out. Good night. Our conversation, which had again become rather one-sided, was at an end. I groped around until I found the doorknob. Oh, yes, my boy, Nightingale called after me. About that philosophical problem of yours. Yes? You are neither big nor small. What am I, then? Medium-sized. So Professor Nightingale really was a mind-reader. When I walked into the classroom the next morning, I might have been entering it for the first time. It seemed so unfamiliar. A new pupil was sitting at my desk, a dodo, an albino dodo, to be precise, because it had bright red eyes and snow-white plumage. I said goodbye to Flower Grazer, Neo, and the dodo, whose name was Odode. They meant nothing to me, those classmates of mine, so I didn't feel the least bit sad. A strange mixture of fear and eagerness overcame me as I followed Professor Nightingale to the exit. The encyclopedia. Once there, he did something I found genuinely surprising because it was so unlike him. He gave me a hug. I had never been as close to him before, not even the previous night. His brief embrace sent another mass of knowledge surging through my brain. Millions of letters whirled around in my mind's eye, then formed themselves into words, scientific facts, whole treaties, and finally into a book whose title flared up in a moment, clearly legible, and then vanished. It was Professor Nightingale's standard work on Zamonia, his accumulated store of knowledge about that continent and its environs. Professor Nightingale's Encyclopedia of Marvels, Life Forms, and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and its Environs, A to Z. He had etched it telepathically, as it were, onto the hard disk of my brain. Another thing, he said in a subdued voice, 2 rules. If you get hungry or thirsty, simply lick the walls of the tunnel. Your thirst will be assuaged by the condensation that always adheres to them. Your hunger by the spongy fungus, whose slight fluorescence provides a modicum of lighting. This contains Bloomberg algae, and is thus a major source of vitamins, minerals, carbohydrates, and roughage. And the second rule, never trust a troglodyte. A troglodyte, I said. What's that? But the professor had already thrust me into the darker of the 2 tunnels, and hurried off with his coat-tails flapping. The road to freedom. Uninviting though it was, the maze of tunnels in the Bloomberg Mountains, I entered it with a feeling of relief. My school days were over. Real life awaited me with open arms. My eyes soon became accustomed to the dim light, and I strode along in its highly optimistic mood. No more stupid, piggish neos or sneaky little gnomelets, no more suicidal unicorns, no more canned sardines of boredom. The dank, dark tunnel seemed a place of beauty because it was taking me to freedom. I had my first misgivings after walking for about an hour. What was I doing in this cheerless labyrinth? Where was the exit? Besides, I was hungry. A can of sardines wouldn't have gone amiss. Why hadn't I simply stayed at the Nocturnal Academy? Why couldn't you remain at school after completing your education? Was there a law against it? I could become an assistant teacher at the Nocturnal Academy, or a janitor for that matter. I would take on the humblest cleaning jobs unpaid. Anything would be better than roaming around in this clammy labyrinth, at the mercy of an uncertain fate. What did I know of the world that awaited me outside? It was a vast and incalculable place, alive with hardships, dangers, and ill-disposed creatures. That much Mac had taught me only too well. On the back of a reptilian rescuer I'd been safe, but now I had to fend for myself. I decided to go back to Professor Nightingale and ask him to keep me on. Why hadn't I thought of that during our conversation last night? A futile decision. I turned on my heel and walked back to the Nocturnal Academy. Yes, I could already picture myself pursuing a comfortable desk-bound career. At the professor's side, I would hand the torch of wisdom to a never-ending stream of grateful students, and in our spare time we would devote ourselves to darknessology. Perhaps Nightingale really was on the track of the secret of eternal life. I could assist him with his experiments and might even give him the hint that helped to achieve the vital breakthrough. We would share the official honors and awards. I wasn't greedy after all. An intersection? I couldn't recall coming to one earlier. Forks, yes. Intersections, no. Thoroughly perplexed, I stopped short and peered in all directions. A drop of condensation fell from the roof and landed plumb on my nose. I had obviously gone astray. Every bend seemed to offer the prospect of salvation, of light at the end of the tunnel, but all I encountered each time was yet another fork and some even more complex ramifications. I thought it was wise to favor tunnels that led downhill because the exit must be at the foot of the mountains, but there were times when they led uphill for hours on end. The downhill tunnels had to be somewhere else entirely. I climbed higher and higher. I felt an occasional puff of wind on my cheek. At first I thought it was fresh mountain air blowing into the cave mouth I longed to reach, but then I realized that it was always the same puff of wind. A prisoner like myself, it had been desperately roaming this labyrinth in search of a way out, perhaps for many thousands of years. I tried to assume that my school days weren't over at all, that this was Professor Nightingale's idea of final examination, and that those who managed to extricate themselves from the labyrinth that passed it. All I had to do was think laterally, turn my thoughts in every possible direction. I debated which field of knowledge would be most helpful to me. Mathematics, philosophy, biology, geology, astronomy, Zamonian poetry. I came to the conclusion that To begin with, my legs would be the greatest help of all. Unfortunately, there couldn't have been any worse condition thanks to my persistent lack of exercise and unbalanced diet. I walked on. Sometimes I broke into a slow trot, sometimes I shuffled along, but I kept going on and on without a break until exhaustion overcame me. Then I sank to the ground and slept for a minute or two before struggling up and plodding onwards for hours and days on end. From time to time I licked a tunnel wall and sampled the rusty mildew and salty condensation that had been clinging to it for millions of years. At least it tasted like that. I took one mechanical step after another. You couldn't call it walking anymore. I tottered along between the tunnel's walls like a drunk, head sagging, shoulders drooping and arms dangling. A picture of misery, a lost, despairing Bluebear, with cramp in the calves. At some stage my strength finally gave out. I lay down, firmly resolved never to get up again. I rest away. For several hours I remained lying on my back, spread-eagled, with my gaze fixed on the roof of the tunnel. I had made up my mind to dematerialize, vanish without trace, rust away like a piece of old iron, and thus become an integral part of the Bluebear Mountains. An old friend. It seems that rusty tunnel walls have an unwholesome effect on the overtaxed brains. I would never have entertained such an idea under normal circumstances, but anyone who has brooded on it for hours will feel, in a truly physical sense, what it's like to rust away. It's a strange but far from unpleasant sensation. You surrender to the forces of nature, utterly serene, then slowly turn metallic. Your body becomes coated by degrees with fine rust-red fur, and starts to crumble. The rust eats into you ever deeper. Layer after layer flakes off, and before long you're just a little mound with red dust, to be blown away by a captive puff of wind and scattered along the endless tunnels of the Bluebear Mountains. That was as far as any dire imaginings had progressed when my shoulders was nudged by something soft and slimy, but not unfamiliar. It was Qwerty Uop. "What are you doing here?" he inquired anxiously. "Rusting away," I replied. It was a while before I could more or less sit up, and it was genuinely surprised me that I didn't crumble away like an old ship's biscuit. Grunting and groaning, I got up off the floor of the tunnel where Qwerty waited impatiently. On my hind paws at last, I felt life seeping back into my bones. Qwerty's presence gave grounds for optimism. Having jointly solved astronomical problems to the greatest magnitude, we'd surely locate the exit together. The dimensional hiatus. "I found a dimensional hiatus," Qwerty announced. "A dimensional hiatus," I replied. "Why, that's wonderful." I sounded rather unconvincing, no doubt, because it meant that we would soon be going our separate ways again. It was quite simple. I stumbled on it, so to speak. In fact, I nearly fell into it, the way I did on the way to my coronation. Come, I'll show you. The dimensional hiatus was in a parallel tunnel just around the corner. However, I'd always had a more glamorous mental picture of the entrance to another dimension. To be honest, I couldn't see a thing. "You can't see it," Qwerty explained. "You can only smell it." I sniffed. A faint, entirely unfamiliar smell hung in the air. "It's definitely a dimensional hiatus. It smells of jinf," said Qwerty. I had no idea what jinf was, nor did I wish to be enlightened. Having found the dimensional hiatus some days earlier, Qwerty had been wondering whether to jump into it ever since. The odds against his landing in his home dimension were several billion to one. I may end up in a dimension teeming with monsters whose staple diet consists of gelatin princes from the 2364th dimension. It's a terrible risk. Perhaps you'll be lucky. I never am. I'm the kind of prince that falls down a dimensional hiatus just before his coronation. I had never seen Qwerty so irresolute. Even though it ran counter to my own wishes, I simply had to encourage him to take the plunge. It was my duty as a friend. If he didn't risk it now, he would never bring himself to do so, and that would leave him roaming our dimension forever in a state of profound unhappiness. I tried to find the right words that were simultaneously motivating, sympathetic, heartening, comforting, and irresistibly persuasive. "Go on, jump," I said. "I can't," he wailed. "What if I land in a sea of boiling tar, or the jaws of a dinosaur? The cosmos contains innumerable places that are harmful to the health of gelatin princes. Some dimensions are reputed to consist of nothing at all. There are billions of situations less favorable than my present predicament. You think too much, that's your problem. You may land in the arms of a pretty gelatin princess from the 2364th dimension. Gelatin princes don't have any arms. Are you absolutely positive it's a genuine dimensional hiatus?" Qwerty sniffed. "It is a dimensional hiatus. I can smell it. Try again. Maybe you're wrong." He took another sniff. "Jimph," he said, "Jimph, without a doubt." And that was when I pushed him in. "Arg" was all he got out before he disappeared into the void. Pushing people into dimensional hiatuses is the sort of thing you do in a fit of youthful impulsiveness without giving much thought to the consequences. But it's not like pushing someone off the edge of a swimming pool. The effects of falling into a cosmic aperture are rather different. An adult would have thought the idea over carefully and decided against it. It wasn't until some minutes after QWERTY had melted into the tunnel rusty floor that I had my first misgivings. What if his fears had been justified? He might even now be expiring in the fangs of a primeval dinosaur, or stewing in a sea of boiling tar. I had probably murdered my best friend. There was only one way to find out. Jump in after him. If QWERTY had landed in a dinosaur's jaws, I myself deserved no other fate. I got ready to jump. On the other hand, if QWERTY really had landed back in his 2364th dimension, there would be no point in my jumping at all. Besides, I would very probably emerge at some utterly outlandish spot in the universe. Even if I did land in the 2364th dimension, it was absolutely inconceivable that I would be able to live on a diet of music produced by instruments made of milk. I drew back. But was this the act of a true friend? What had I got to lose? After all, QWERTY's dimensional hiatus seemed to be the only way out of his diabolical labyrinth. I held my nose like a diver and prepared to leap into the unknown. "Jumping off the edge of the pool is strictly prohibited," growled a stern voice. I spun around. A peculiar figure emerged from beyond the bend in the tunnel. Short and thick-set, it was precisely half my height and entirely covered with warts and scattered tufts of hair. It looked like an old beetroot afflicted with some frightful skin disease. Who are you?" I asked uncertainly. "The Troglotroll." "I'm a Troglotroll," the figure blurted out. "No, wait, that's wrong. I'm a swimming pool superintendent disguised just for fun as a Troglotroll. I may bear a superficial resemblance to a Troglotroll, but I'm really a swimming pool superintendent. Ack, ack, ack." Even the gnome's laughter was peculiar. From the Encyclopedia of Marbles, Life Forms, and Other Phenomena of Zimonia and its Environs, by Professor Abdullah Nightingale. Troglotroll, the distantly related to the common gnomelet, the Troglotroll can claim to be the most despised creature in Zimonia, more even so than the Bolog. Whereas other malignant life forms are at least distinguished by their audacity or demand respect on account of their physical superiority, the Troglotroll possesses no laudable attributes at all. Worse still, it doesn't even pretend to any and rejoices in its obnoxiousness. In certain administrative districts in Zimonia, Troglotroll is considered a personal insult, carrying a heavy fine. It has been known to spark off barroom brawls, duels, family feuds, even minor civil wars. The Troglotroll is a semi-humanoid shadow parasite of the lowest order. In other words, it favors dim, dank surroundings, shuns daylight, and lives in another creature's homes, mountain maggot, without, of course, asking their permission or paying them rent. "To be quite honest, I'm not really a swimming pool superintendent," the figure said very quickly. "I'm a mines inspector. I inspect mines." It gave the tunnel wall an experimental tap. "Yes, very nice. Excellent tunneling technique," it muttered approvingly, and continued to tap the wall with its knuckles. "What the H?" it cried suddenly, flinging its arms wide in theatrical gesture. "Why tell a lie? I'm not a mines inspector at all. I'm the Emperor of Zimonia, on a secret mission. Traveling incognito, hence my disguise. I may bear a superficial resemblance to a common Troglotroll, but underneath I'm an all-powerful monarch. That explains the absence of a sumptuous coronation in my rather shabby get-up. It's camouflage, that's all." Very slowly I edged along the wall of the tunnel, ready to take to my heels at any moment. I was obviously dealing with a madman. "All right, I admit it," said the creature, withdrawing its former assertion but unmasked. "I'm not the Emperor of Zimonia. I'm a Pelp. Although we Pelps bear a superficial resemblance to Troglotrolls, we're far more noble-minded. That's what I am, a Pelp in Troglotroll's clothing. Does that sound convincing?" "Yes, very convincing," I said in a faltering voice, still edging slowly backwards. I had almost reached the bend. Once there, I would run for it. All right, I am a Troglotroll," the creature suddenly yelled. "The bane of the Gloombergs, a repulsive, warty, hairy creature with evil intentions, an object of universal loathing, a social outcast." The Troglotroll subsided on his hands and knees and crawled around in front of me, sobbing bitterly. The situation was becoming more and more unpleasant. "You may kick and bit if you like," he whimpered, looking up at me with tear-filled eyes. "Everyone else does." I cautiously approached the Troglotroll and gave him an encouraging pat on the back. Now, things could be worse, I said consolingly. I promptly regretted having touched him because my palm was smeared with greasy sweat, which gave off a rancid smell. How would you know? He snapped, so brusquely that I shrank back like someone recoiling from a dog that had suddenly displayed signs of rabies. You think I chose this life? The Troglotrol got to his feet and glared at me. This filthy fur, these warts, this eternal vegetating in the dark tunnels, devoid of fresh air, deprived of light, destitute of hope. Do you think that's the career I had in mind for myself? It wasn't easy to devise an encouraging, inoffensive response. I made a surreptitious attempt to wipe my paw on the wall of the tunnel. I'd much rather be a butterfly. His voice took on an airy, dainty note. A thing of beauty, fluttering without a care in the sunlight. He gave a rather unsuccessful imitation of the fluttering of a butterfly's wings. I was beginning to feel sorry for him. To exist simply to gladden people's hearts, to give pleasure, to exist to be good. The Troglotrol performed a few clumsy pirouettes and stopped short and stared gloomily at the ground. Is that such a reprehensible ambition? He wasn't such a bad fellow after all. The rudiments of self-improvement and the intention to achieve it were definitely present. But I'm just a Troglotrol. His voice sounded once more as if it had come from the depths of a well shaft. The most despicable creature in the history of creation. That's me. I'm the bitter end. He banged his head against the wall. It made a hollow, disagreeable sound. I'd sooner be a cockroach, he whimpered, or a tick, or even bacteria have a better reputation. I tried to buck him up. Outward appearances don't matter. True beauty comes from within. I blushed even today at the banality of my attempt to console him. But that's just it, sobbed the Troglotrol. I'm utterly depraved on the inside as well. Lying and cheating, acting malicious for no reason, and taking pride in it, that's my forte. That I'm first class at. Looking for an unscrupulous rogue? I'm your man, but a single good deed? Impossible. And then I had an idea which might justly be described as brilliant. I was reminded of the battling billows. They had converged on me with evil intent, but turned over a new leaf by teaching me to speak. I've had an idea. We'll kill two birds with one stone. You simply show me the way out. Like that, I'll escape from this labyrinth. You'll perform a good deed. It's the answer to all our problems. Do you know the way out? The Troglotrol eyed me mistrustfully. Of course, often been there. Not a nice place, though. Too much fresh air, too much light, but I can take you there all right. Sure, it'll help. 100% sure. I know people whose lives have been transformed by a good deed. I was at least certain that the Troglotrol's good deed would change my own life for the better. I'm unconvinced, he said, but we may as well give it a try. A good deed. I could see a change take place in the Troglotrol as he walked on ahead. Having at first shuffled morosely along in front of me, he progressively straightened up. His gait became light and springy, almost balletic. Ack, 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 he chuckled. It's incredible. The nearer we get to the exit, the better I feel. I'm in great form. I feel, how can I put it? Good? Good, that's just the word for it. I feel good. That's the reward for your good deed, I explained. A clear conscience. It really perks you up. I think I'm going to change my entire way of life, the Troglotrol cried eagerly. I could do so much good. I could come with you, leave the Gloomberg Mountains, go to some impoverished country and help the needy, perform a good deed every day. Ack, ack, ack. That's a very laudable intention, I told him encouragingly. Once you know how the system works, you can't just stop. It's like an addiction. I was feeling rather proud of myself, I can't deny. It's nice to be able to help someone, especially in such a practical way. Absolutely, I can hardly wait to perform my next good deed. I'd have never thought myself capable of such a thing. You'll never know till you try. And you'd really take me with you? Asked the Troglotrol. On your adventures, I mean. What gave you that idea? Well, I thought we might, the two of us together, out there, he broke off. You really want to leave the Gloombergs? I'd never dare on my own. But with someone like you, well, that would be another matter. I studied the Troglotrol in profile. I was beginning to regret my helpfulness. It certainly wouldn't be any easier to make my way in real life burdened with a creature like that, but I had to finish what I'd begun. Naturally, I said, of course I'll take you along. The Troglotrol performed a touching little dance of joy in front of me and gave me his hand. I clasped it. It was even more moist and sticky than his back. We walked for several hours, but still no cave mouth came in sight. Is it very far now? I asked. I should say so, ack, 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 tittered the Troglotrol. And he darted down a side tunnel. What are you doing? I called after him. Leaving you in the lurch, he called back out of the darkness. What? Why are you doing this? His reply came from very far off. Hard to say, I'm a Troglotrol. That's all, I can't help myself. He was so far away by now I could barely hear him. I've led you much deeper into the maze. You were quite close to the exit when we met. Ack, 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 ack. The last I heard of him was his mocking laughter. Then I was alone again. I sat down on the tunnel floor and started laughing too. It wasn't a very nice laugh. In fact, the very sound of it gave me the creeps. If there's one piece of advice I can give the readers of my autobiography, it's this: never trust a Troglotroll. I'd reached the end of the road. That much was certain. I was utterly exhausted and bereft of hope. All my faith in orders, especially Troglotrolls, had been destroyed. I felt at least 100 lives old. I lay down on an intersection, one that seemed very familiar to me, and promptly fell asleep. Bad news from a puff of wind. I was roused by a gentle current of air in my ear. I sat up. "Hello," said a faint voice. There was no one to be seen. "Where are you?" I asked. "Here, right in front of you," whispered the voice. "I can't see you." "Nobody can. I'm a puff of wind." It was a puff of wind I'd felt several times. I never conversed with one before, but I decided to give it a try. "Do you know the way out of the Gloombergs?" I asked. "I'd hardly be flitting around in these stuffy caves if I did," the puff of wind replied. "I'd be wafting over the mountains and seas with my brothers and sisters. I'd be propelling the clouds across the sky or brewing up a tremendous storm. I'd be doing something useful like blowing a ship across the ocean or driving a windmill. Anything rather than going to seed in this crazy labyrinth." "How did you get in here?" "It was the most disastrous moment in my life, believe me. I curse it to this day. I was sailing over the Gloombergs in glorious, sunny autumn weather, free as air," the puff of wind sighed. "Then I passed this mountainside here. It was full of caves. I wafted over to him and peered in, wondering what they were like inside. I looked around for a bit, and there you have it. The whole sad story. I've been searching for the exit ever since. How did you get in?" "My teacher sent me." "Nightingale?" asked the puff of wind. "Yes, how come you know his name?" "I've come across a lot of people in here who curse his name. Their bones lie scattered everywhere in this labyrinth." My blood ran cold. "Perhaps we should join forces," I said. "Two might find the exit quicker than one." The puff of wind gave a contemptuous whistle. "I doubt it. You're far too slow. By the time you'd groped your way along a stretch of tunnel, I'd have searched it 100 times, and I've been in this labyrinth for over 4,000 years. That'll give you some idea of your chances." "Ack, ack, ack!" The puff of wind's malicious laughter sounded strangely familiar. Still cackling, it materialized before my eyes and assumed the shape of a Troglotroll. "You must be thinking I'm a Troglotroll," it said, "but I'm not one at all. I'm just a puff of wind that has temporarily taken on the guise of a Troglotroll. That sounds convincing, doesn't it?" I tensed every muscle, poised to spring at the little gnome and throttle him until he showed me the exit, when the ground started to vibrate. "Oh, a tunnel quake," remarked the Troglotroll. "You'd better dissolve into thin air like me. If you don't, I can't vouch for your survival." Ack, ack, ack. Still crackling, he vanished, and I woke up. One thing I hadn't dreamed. The ground really was shaking badly. I could also hear a frightening noise, a loud, savage, ominous din, an audible threat. It sounded as if something was deliberately and inexorably heading straight for me, through the Iron Mountain. There were sounds of grating and grinding like icebergs colliding, and sometimes I thought I had heard a kind of belch, as loud and hollow as if it had been emitted by a dragon at the bottom of the well. Then came a fiery hiss and crackle, and the air became unbearably hot. The wall of the tunnel started to glow like a hot plate, red at first, then yellow and finally white, until it dissolved into a pool of molten iron. I had to leap aside to prevent my paws from being burnt by the stream of metal. The noises died away, and a dense cloud of greasy black vapor came gushing through the hole in the wall. My fear was overridden by my eagerness to know what had caused this spectacle. When the smoke slowly drifted away down the tunnels and became less dense, I was able to make out the figure on the other side of the hole. It was roughly 3 times my height and made of gleaming metal. From the Encyclopedia of Marvels, Lifeforms, and Other Phenomena of Zamonia and its Environs by Professor Abdullah Nightingale, Mountain Maggot, the. Although its outward appearance renders this hard to believe, the mountain or iron maggot, Verbus mountainus, belongs to the same family as the common earthworm, but is much more highly developed. The mountain maggot bears a biological resemblance, on the one hand, to the primitive whipworm, Trichocephalus dispar, especially in regards to its digestive organs, on the other, to the structurally far more complex tube-dwelling worm, Hermela complexinus. At a mature stage of development, mountain maggots attain roughly the size of cloven-hoofed steppe unicorn, and are thus Zamonia's third largest species of worm, surpassed only by the lower Zamonian chalkleech and the Midgard serpent. They live by gnawing their way through the mineral deposits on the Gloomberg Mountains, their only habitat, filtering the nutrients out of the metal they devour, and digesting them. For this purpose they are equipped with a masticatory masticatory organs so exceptional that any saurian predator would covet them. The mature mountain maggot is also capable of spitting fire like the firework dragon of the Brazilian rainforest, to which it is not, however, related, for dragons belong to the nodulodermal family, whereas the mountain maggot's epidermis is so smooth that it looks polished. Its entire body does, in fact, consist of gleaming stainless steel. Its lower jaw is shaped like an excavator shovel, edged with saw teeth coated in diamond dust. It has pincers in lieu of hands and steel claws in lieu of feet, and its body terminates in a huge tapering metal file. The mechanical appearance of the mountain maggot has given rise to the belief that it may be of man-made origin and hail from another planet or another dimension. It is more probable that nature has found its own way of defying the hostile environment of the Gloomberg Mountains by countering it with a metallic life form. The mountain maggot is probably the strongest creature on our continent relative to its size. Its outward appearance is one of the most impressive sights Simonia has to offer, and its potential dangers can only be likened to those of an omnivorous saber-toothed saurian when robbed of its young. Professor Nightingale is exaggerating here. The creature that stood before me in a pool of molten iron without even noticing it looked truly fearsome, I grant you. It would be easy for me to embroider a bloodthirsty legend still further and tell how I waged a death-defying battle with the monster, but my lives have been so rich in breathtaking experiences that I've no need to contribute to the Zimonian public's mistaken image of the mountain maggot. There is enough literature of that sort, books entitled How I Mastered the Mountain Maggot or Stainless Steel Satan, in which self-styled experts on the mountain maggot describe their alleged duels with the creature. The fact is that none of these authors has ever set foot in the Gloombergs, and that all their information about this peaceable creature was acquired from second or third hand, largely from legends passed on by word of mouth or from another, equally worthless books on the subject.